There is a strange truth about human nature that most people only discover after pain has already taught it to them. People rarely recognize the value of what they have while it is still present. Attention is taken for granted. Loyalty is assumed. Presence becomes invisible. And then, only after distance is created, only after you step back and remove yourself from constant availability, do people suddenly begin to see you clearly again. Stoicism does not interpret this as injustice. It interprets it as nature. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that human beings act according to their impressions, not according to truth, and impressions are often distorted by familiarity. What is always available becomes mentally discounted. What is absent becomes exaggerated in importance. This is not emotional weakness alone. It is a structural feature of perception. This is why the central lesson of Stoicism is not to chase recognition, but to master detachment. The moment you begin to rely on external validation, you place your peace in the hands of something unstable. Praise can disappear overnight. Attention can shift without warning. Even respect, once freely given, can fade under the weight of familiarity. But your character, your choices, your discipline, these remain under your control. And here is where the deeper transformation begins. When you stop overextending yourself for people who only notice you in your absence, something powerful happens. You begin to reclaim your energy. You begin to understand that your value was never dependent on their awareness of it. It was always present, but obscured by overexposure and expectation. The Stoics called this returning to what is within your control, your judgments, your actions, your restraint. Everything else is secondary. And yet most people reverse this order. They try to control perception, influence opinion, secure approval, and maintain constant visibility, while neglecting the one thing that actually defines them, their internal discipline. But life has a way of correcting this imbalance. When you are always available, your presence becomes background noise. When you are always reactive, your voice loses weight. When you are always explaining yourself, your authority dissolves. And without realizing it, you teach others to undervalue your presence simply because it has no boundaries. Stoic wisdom interrupts this cycle. It teaches that withdrawal is not abandonment. Silence is not weakness. Distance is not revenge. It is clarity. It is the restoration of proportion between what you give and what others perceive. And so the question is not why people value you more after you walk away. The question is why you needed to be absent for them to notice what was already there. There is a principle in Stoic thought that explains this phenomenon with unsettling precision. Scarcity sharpens perception. When something becomes less available, the mind assigns it greater significance. This is not manipulation. It is psychology. But Stoicism takes it further by asking a deeper question. Why were you distributing your presence so freely that it lost its weight in the first place? Seneca wrote extensively about the danger of living for the crowd. The crowd is inconsistent. It applauds today and forgets tomorrow. It elevates and discards with equal ease. When you anchor your sense of worth to such instability, you become unstable yourself. But when you learn to stand apart from it, something changes in your posture, both internally and externally. Strategic silence is not withdrawal from life. It is withdrawal from unnecessary reaction. It is the discipline of not responding to every opinion, every provocation, every subtle attempt to pull you into emotional disturbance. Most people think power is expressed through response. Stoicism suggests the opposite. Real power is expressed through restraint. When you stop explaining yourself excessively, people begin to assign more meaning to your words. When you stop chasing attention, your presence begins to carry its own gravity. When you stop reacting to every misunderstanding, your silence forces others to reconsider their assumptions. But this only works when it is rooted in self-mastery, not ego. If silence is used as punishment, it becomes emotional dependence in disguise. Stoicism rejects this. The goal is not to control others through absence, but to free yourself from dependence on their perception entirely. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that external events do not disturb the soul. It is the judgment we attach to them that creates disturbance. The same applies to recognition. The absence of appreciation is not harm unless you judge it as necessary for your identity. And so when you walk away, not in anger, not in performance, but in calm detachment, you are no longer negotiating your value. You are revealing it. People who are accustomed to your constant availability suddenly encounter the reality of your absence. And in that space, reflection begins. But the Stoic does not wait for reflection. He continues forward, because value that depends on being seen is not true value at all. It is performance. Real value remains intact whether observed or ignored. One of the most difficult Stoic lessons to internalize is immunity to criticism. Not because criticism is meaningless, but because most of it is misaligned with truth. Human beings judge from limited perspective, emotional bias, and incomplete information. If you allow every judgment to influence your sense of self, you become fragmented, pulled in different directions by voices that do not understand your full context. Epictetus was direct about this. He taught that if someone speaks badly of you, it reveals something about their perception, not your essence. Yet most people live as though external opinion is a verdict rather than a reflection. They adjust themselves constantly, hoping to stabilize how they are seen, while losing stability in who they actually are. This is where walking away becomes symbolic, not as escape, but as refusal. Refusal to participate in the constant negotiation of approval. When you step back from environments that require you to shrink, explain, or constantly prove yourself, you begin to recover mental clarity. And something subtle happens. The same people who overlooked your presence begin to re-evaluate it. Not because you changed, but because the reference point changed. Distance alters perception. Absence interrupts assumption. And suddenly what was once ignored becomes noticeable. But Stoicism warns against becoming attached to this reversal. If you walk away only to be noticed, you are still governed by external validation. The deeper aim is indifference. Whether valued or ignored, you remain aligned with your principles. This is why Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the idea of inner citadel, a place within the mind untouched by applause or rejection, a place where judgment is not outsourced. In that space, you no longer perform for understanding. You simply act according to virtue. And when a person reaches that state, something paradoxical occurs. They become more respected without seeking respect. They become more influential without chasing influence. They become more valued precisely because they are no longer dependent on being valued. Not everyone will understand this shift. Some will only notice your absence. Others will only remember your presence after it is gone. But the Stoic does not organize life around who notices. He organizes life around what is right. Adversity plays a hidden role in this entire transformation. When you are undervalued, overlooked, or taken for granted, it is easy to interpret the situation as rejection. Stoicism reframes it as training. Every instance of being ignored becomes an opportunity to detach from external dependency. Every moment of being underestimated becomes raw material for inner strengthening. Amor fati is not passive acceptance. It is active transformation. It is the decision to use every circumstance, even the uncomfortable ones, as fuel for refinement. If people only value you after distance is created, then distance itself becomes a teacher. It shows you where attachment still existed. It exposes where validation still mattered. Self-discipline enters here as the stabilizing force. Without discipline, walking away becomes emotional reaction. With discipline, it becomes strategic clarity. You stop overextending. You stop over-explaining. You stop investing energy where it is not reciprocated, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. And gradually, your internal world becomes less dependent on external feedback. You begin to measure yourself by consistency rather than reaction, by principles rather than applause, by long-term direction rather than temporary acknowledgement. This is the final turning point, when you no longer need to disappear for people to recognize your value, because recognition is no longer your currency. You have already shifted the source of value inward. And yet the paradox remains. The more grounded you become internally, the more your external presence changes. People notice calmness. They notice restraint. They notice absence of neediness. And without you saying anything, your value becomes more visible simply because it is no longer diluted by desperation. But none of this is the goal. It is a byproduct. The Stoic does not walk away to be valued. He walks away to remain aligned with himself. And so the real question emerges deeper than before. If value does not require recognition and presence does not require validation, then what would your life look like if you stopped returning to places where you are only understood in your absence? There comes a stage in a person's development where the need to be understood begins to fade. Not because understanding becomes less important, but because the need for constant validation becomes unnecessary. In Stoic terms, this is the shift from external dependence to internal sovereignty. It is the moment you stop asking the world to confirm your worth and begin acting as if your worth was never in question. At this stage, walking away is no longer an emotional response. It becomes a form of alignment. You do not leave to provoke recognition. You leave because continued presence in places that misinterpret you drains clarity. And clarity for the Stoic is more valuable than approval. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he would encounter misunderstanding, ingratitude, and even betrayal, not as exceptions, but as natural expressions of human limitation. When you expect this, you are no longer shaken by it. You begin to see people not as threats to your peace, but as participants in their own limited perception of reality. And this is where the power of emotional distance begins to reveal itself. Not coldness, not detachment from humanity, but freedom from dependency. You can engage without being absorbed. You can observe without being controlled. You can participate without losing yourself. Most people underestimate how much of their suffering comes from over-involvement in how they are perceived. Every silence must be filled. Every misunderstanding must be corrected. Every opinion must be managed. Over time, this creates exhaustion disguised as social engagement. Stoicism calls this loss of self-governance. The solution is not isolation. The solution is proportion. To give attention where it is deserved and to withdraw it where it is wasted. To speak when speech has value, and to remain silent when silence preserves integrity. When this balance is achieved, something subtle begins to shift in how others relate to you. Your presence becomes less predictable. Your reactions become less accessible. And because of that, they become more meaningful. People begin to notice that you are not emotionally available on demand. And paradoxically, this is often when respect returns. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped overgiving yourself in spaces that could not recognize it. There is a misconception that Stoicism teaches emotional suppression. It does not. It teaches emotional governance. There is a difference between denying emotion and refusing to be ruled by it. The Stoic does not pretend indifference. He cultivates stability. This distinction matters deeply when understanding why people only value you after you walk away. If your presence was previously driven by emotional urgency, fear of being forgotten, desire to be validated, or need to be included, then your absence creates contrast. It reveals what was previously taken for granted. Seneca often warned against living in anticipation of external judgment. He understood that when you live for others' reactions, you become reactive yourself. But when you detach from that cycle, your decisions become deliberate rather than compulsive. Walking away, in this sense, is not abandonment. It is restoration of equilibrium. It is the correction of imbalance between what you give and what you receive. It is the refusal to remain in environments where your value is only recognized in hindsight. And yet, Stoicism is not concerned with how others respond to your absence. It is concerned with whether your absence reflects integrity. If you leave because you are not being valued, but internally you still crave recognition, then the chain is not broken. It is merely extended. True detachment is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not seek confirmation. It does not wait for reaction. It simply moves according to principle. This is why the Stoic does not become emotionally invested in being missed. Being missed is still external validation. The goal is not to become unforgettable. The goal is to become uncheckable. And when a person reaches this state, their relationship with attention changes completely. They no longer chase it. They no longer fear its absence. They no longer interpret it as measure of worth. Attention becomes optional, not essential. At that point, walking away loses its emotional weight. It becomes just another expression of self-respect. One of the most overlooked consequences of strategic silence is how it forces reality to speak louder than personality ever could. When you are constantly explaining yourself, you are shaping perception through words. But when you withdraw unnecessary explanation, people are left with only evidence to interpret you. And evidence is often more powerful than persuasion. This is why absence can feel so transformative in social dynamics. It removes noise. It removes emotional framing. It removes constant interpretation. What remains is memory, and memory tends to become more idealized with distance. But Stoicism does not rely on this effect. It does not build identity on how others reconstruct you in your absence. Instead, it emphasizes that your value must remain constant regardless of narrative shifts. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when you stop trying to control what is not yours. Reputation is not yours. Interpretation is not yours. Opinion is not yours. What is yours is your action, your choice, your response. When this is fully understood, walking away becomes simpler. You are no longer trying to correct perception. You are no longer trying to fix misunderstanding. You are no longer trying to preserve an image. You are simply choosing environments aligned with your principles. And yet, something interesting always happens afterward. People begin to reconsider. They begin to reflect. They begin to assign meaning to your absence that they did not assign to your presence. Not because you changed, but because their attention was finally interrupted. Stoicism, however, would caution against interpreting this as victory, because victory implies dependence on outcome. The Stoic does not win by being noticed. He wins by not needing to be. And so the real transformation is internal. You begin to realize that your peace was never supposed to be negotiated in social spaces. It was supposed to be protected within you. Once that realization stabilizes, the need to walk away for validation disappears. You walk away only when alignment requires it. At the deepest level, this entire philosophy is about reclaiming ownership of the self. Not ownership in the material sense, but in the psychological sense. Most people unknowingly lease their identity to external feedback. They feel valuable when valued and diminished when ignored. This creates instability that follows them everywhere. Stoicism interrupts this pattern by anchoring identity in principle rather than perception. If you know what kind of person you are becoming, external opinion becomes secondary noise. Amor fati plays a crucial role here. Even the experience of being undervalued becomes useful. It teaches restraint. It reveals attachment. It exposes dependency. And once exposed, it can be corrected. So when people only recognize your worth after you walk away, the Stoic interpretation is not emotional satisfaction. It is understanding. Understanding that perception is delayed, not accurate. And understanding that delay does not define truth. The ultimate goal is not to be valued correctly by others. It is to remain correct in yourself, regardless of how others value you. This is why Marcus Aurelius emphasized returning to one's center repeatedly. The world will pull you outward, toward approval, toward criticism, toward attention, but your task is always the same. Return inward. And when you do, something profound becomes clear. You were never missing value. You were simply surrounded by systems that could not fully recognize it in real time. But the Stoic does not wait for recognition to stabilize identity. He builds identity so strong that recognition becomes irrelevant. And in that state, walking away is no longer a statement. It is simply a consequence of self-respect. Because once you no longer depend on being seen to know your worth, you finally understand the deepest Stoic truth of all. Your value was never in their recognition. It was always in your discipline,